Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first learning journey for this year's nonprofit conference. It's a mouthful. It's called the Regenerative City and its Commons. And so I'll give you some background about this first. The Transforming the Nonprofit Sector Conference is a 3-year partnership between Tote Board and IPS. And we organize a series of panel discussions and learning journeys that lead up to a conference at the end of the year. So if you're interested to attend the conference, it's like October 4th. So block it in your calendar first and we'll send out the invites in due time. The theme for this year's conference is another mouthful. It's called Solutions That Help Us Help One Another. And the idea is that it's about mutual aid and the commons. Because the premise is that I think for the nonprofit sector, we are familiar with centralized, coordinated, and philanthropic models of providing help. So increasingly more funding goes to increasingly professionalized services that are centrally coordinated and developed. And I think even the people who are successful doing that have realized that there are limits to this model, and there's increasing interest in exploring community-led initiatives. And so that's why we wanted to kind of understand this better. The whole conference itself is structured as a collective learning journey. So, which is why we invited people with interesting ideas to come share with us. And then we'll have local discussions kind of weigh in on these new ideas, relatively new in our context, and whether it works for us. So I wanted to kind of talk about why and I'm so glad we have the privilege of having Rob Hopkins with us, and he's the founder of Transitions Towns Network. But I wanted to say first why I thought Transition Towns was particularly interesting. The way that I kind of first understood the movement itself was that this was a local response to a very, very big problem, right? So the very big and very large global problem. And I'm taking a leaf off. So Elaine from Center for Livable Cities with us, and I recently attended their kind of scenario planning, and they're looking out for these big problems, right? They're talking about, global climate change, biosphere collapse, extreme weather events. They care about geopolitical risks to energy supply, increasing social inequality, etc., etc. So that's part of, the kind of landscape of things we all should care about. But then you zoom down to the local neighborhood level and small communities, and we often feel, well, what can we do about that? And then suddenly, there's this Totnes transitions town, and people came together, and it sounds small and local, but it became big and serious. So at the practical level, it sounds insignificant, but it actually isn't. It's people coming together, forming companies to, install solar panels, form community gardens, and localize the food system, and maybe creating worker co-ops or community currencies or time banks, etc., etc. All things that sound nice and fun and neighborly. But transition towns was interesting to me because it became what is called distributed, right? It was a distributed movement of different towns and different groups being inspired by one another. And Rob created this infrastructure for different communities to connect with one another, to be inspired by one another. And so that's why we wanted to understand this logic, which is quite different from the usual institutional logic of making some kind of important big social change is either government or big funders, and then they work with large nonprofits who have some kind of service model, right? And then you want to scale it across the nation. And this almost, to me, is like a different paradigm. Not saying that one is better than the other, but I feel that the other paradigm, we don't have quite the muscle to appreciate it as well as the first paradigm, of which we are quite successful at. And so Rob is the co-founder of Transition Network and Transition Town Totnes. He wrote this book, which I read, which is called wonderfully "The Power of Just Doing Stuff: How Local Action Can Change the World." But he's also recently wrote about another book called "From What Is to What If," and he'll tell us a bit about that as well. And as I'm reading his bio, I'm remembering the story. He's also the director of New Lion Brewery. And it's not just because I enjoy drinking my beer, but I remember this story, and it must have come from his writing somewhere about how if a local community comes together. So this is a community-owned brewery, and Rob can correct me if I'm wrong, and maybe it was struggling, but the community came together to save it, right? To refurbish it or whatever. And then, it's a thriving local pub brewery now. And so people were asking, what will you do next? Will you go around the nation to scale your efforts and save pubs across the nation? And of course, the answer is no, it's not about scaling, right? It's about moving on to something else the local community wants to do, right? So I don't know if that's correct or not, but which is why we've invited Rob to share with us. And so I hope this session, he will tell us what is Transition Town, why should the community take local and small scale action, why not markets and the government, or perhaps how to work with the markets and the government, how big is the movement, what kind of difference has it made already, and then maybe we can figure out together how do you start local action and what sustains such local action, because often small groups do some things and then they burn out, but somehow this movement has sustained itself. So what's the secret sauce that makes it work? And later on, I'll introduce Harvey Neo and Elaine Tan will be the discussant a little bit more, but without further ado, let's hear from Rob. Over to you, Rob.
Well, good morning, everybody. So lovely to see you all and lovely to be here. And thank you, Justin, for the introduction. I think it sounds insignificant, but it's not, is fantastic. And I think I might have to have that printed on some T-shirts for the transition movement. And so I'm just going to share my screen, if I can do that, so then I can show you some pictures. Okay. Beginning. So yes, I'm going to talk about the transition movement and where it came from and what it looks like. I guess I always like to start just by framing what I'm going to say in the context of the climate and ecological emergency. And my reading of the climate scientists and the time that I spend with climate scientists who are now so concerned about climate change and about the inaction of our governments that they are gluing themselves to the front of government buildings. There is a huge amount of despair among that scientific community. And for me, my thinking about climate change has been that always that it goes far beyond the idea that we just all change to electric cars and put some solar panels on. It's a profound challenge, I think, to really reimagine everything. Our education system, our transport system, our food system, our energy system, all needs to be profoundly reimagined. And the starting premise of the transition movement is that we can either see that as something terrifying and awful, or we can really embrace that opportunity to really reimagine everything. And the way that I like to think about this is and I'm not showing you this graph as a graph particularly, I'm showing you this as if it were a mountain, in that over the last 200 years, the global north has kind of climbed this mountain of what it imagines to be progress. And now we stand on top of here. Some people have spectacular views from the top of this mountain, not everybody. And beneath our feet is more plastic, more debt, more carbon, more inequality, more anxiety than we've ever stood on top of before. And the guides who are with us, who understand this mountain, are pointing to the very dark storm clouds moving very quickly towards us. And they're saying, we need to get down off this mountain. We need to get down off this mountain really, really quickly. And for some of us, that's enough in motivation, right? They're the experts. They know the mountain. They're our guides. But for a lot of people, that doesn't seem to work. So one of the ideas that has always underpinned the transition movement is, what if instead we told the stories about the lower part of this mountain, about the valleys at the bottom, and we could tell the stories about the delicious food and wine that waits for us there, the comfortable beds and the warm firesides and the dry socks that are waiting for us when we make our way safely down this mountain. Because we are only going to move away from our current economy and our current culture to something better if that's what it feels like, if it feels like we are moving towards something better, something irresistible, something delicious. So our work for me is about how do we cultivate longing for a low carbon future. And that is work that goes far beyond facts and figures and reports and policy. And it takes us into the space of imagination and storytelling and music and street art and poetry and hands-on kind of activism. So that's a fundamental idea that underpins what I want to talk about. How do we bring alive in the imaginations of people a different vision of the future, which we can then long for? And in the US, the Institute for the Future have this fantastic statement on their window. They say any useful statement about the future should at first seem ridiculous. You know, I feel like one of the things that I've learned about climate change is that it really means that we have to move away from the idea of policy change being a small incremental process. And COVID has shown us that if we decide, underpinned by scientific evidence, to move really fast, we can move really fast. And so I always say to groups that I meet, your ideas should sound a bit ridiculous because that's the level of ambition that we need now. So there are lots of historical examples. This is one that I love from America in the late 1960s. I always look at this picture and think how slim everybody looks. I don't think it would be like that today. But this was a time in America where if you went to the beach, you could park your car on the beach, literally on the beach. So this was how everything happened for years. And then presumably sometime the rule changed and people said, actually, wouldn't it be nicer to go to the beach and it not be covered in cars? But you can guarantee that when that happened, someone would have said, but I can't imagine going to the beach and not being able to park my car on the beach. But it changed and things got really better as a result of that. This is a factory that was built in 1941 in the United States during the war. They built this factory from scratch in 6 months. And when it was built, it made one of these planes every hour with 1 million working parts. You know, if we decide to mobilize around the climate emergency with the scale of ambition it demands, we can do that. There are many historical examples of that happening. The challenge that we face, one of the challenges, I think, is that our imagination, our collective imagination, and Justin mentioned that I'd been writing a book about imagination because I think it's really important, because our imagination muscle should be like this. And in many cases, it's increasingly like this. This was research published by a researcher called Kyung-hee Kim, which looked at the imagination in the United States using data sets that went back to the 1960s. Her conclusion was that IQ and imagination rose together until the mid-1960s. No, sorry, till the mid-1990s. And then IQ continued to rise and imagination started to fall. And this research made it onto the front page of Newsweek magazine. It was a really big story. People said, oh, what does this mean for economic growth? Or what does this mean for Hollywood? No one ever said, what does this mean for the climate crisis? Because we cannot build what we cannot imagine. And as Marianne McCabe, who's an activist in the US, puts it, we live in a system that has been locked into a false sense of inevitability. We have to make the space in our organizations, in our communities, in our businesses, in our universities to really think really, really big and ambitious. And if we don't intentionally make that space, then it doesn't happen. So one of the ways I think that we can cultivate longing is through art. This is a guy I love called James Mackay, who draws the future. And this is his drawing where he says, what would our cities look like if they became the most biodiverse places they could possibly be? And this is his image of that, which for me, this beautifully generates longing for that future. You know, you can almost smell what that world might taste like. This is his image of, well, what happens as we take more and more cars out of our cities? You know, in our cities, we give cars a lot of space. What if we take that space back, as is happening now in more and more cities? What could we do with that space? Maybe we fill it with gardens like this. This is completely possible. But again, we have to cultivate the longing for it first, and that's where the storytelling and the art and the imagination and the play comes in. So I want to talk a bit about the transition movement. That's the main focus of what I want to say, which started in 2005 when I moved to the town where I now live, a town called Totnes in the southwest of England. It's a town of about 9,000 people. And I moved here very concerned about climate change, and with an idea which we later came to express like this. So we said, if we wait for governments, it'll be too late. If we try and act as individuals, it'll be too little. But if we act as communities, it might just be enough, and it might just be in time. So we started a process where we said, we really don't know what we're doing, but we have a feeling that there is a key part of this story, which is what we can do at this level. If communities could mobilize, could bring their passion, what they care about, could mobilize their resources, could bring their skills, then they become a key piece of this change that needs to happen. Communities can move faster than government and local government and business. They're more nimble, they're more adaptable. So we started a process in my town, which we launched in 2006, and we called it Transition Town, because like our image of the mountain, it's the most important piece is how do we come down off that mountain? And that's not just a purely intellectual process. It's a process that will also involve a lot of grief, a lot of letting go of the future that we maybe thought we were going to have. It will involve the need to support each other, to not get exhausted and not get burnt out, to be able to keep the momentum. You know, so we started it in my town, and it very rapidly started to spread. This is Brixton in London, which launched the process shortly after we did. And very quickly after we started in my town, we found people around the world were doing this in many different places. They were finding videos on YouTube. They were reading blogs that we did. So we started an organization called Transition Network to support the spread of the transition movement. And one of the things that I find most interesting, there was a researcher called Luigi Russi, who wrote a beautiful book about the transition movement. And he said for him, the thing that was most interesting was not the transition movement as a thing that academics could look at and measure. He was what he called the transition moving. So the way that the transition movement has changed and adapted and evolved over time. So every book that I've written is basically a snapshot of what transition is at that point, rather than a top-down process of Transition Network telling transition groups what they should be doing. It's a self-organizing movement. We suggested some principles, we built a network to support them, and then our role is to collect their stories, share their stories, to encourage them, to inspire them, to network them, and then to look at what they're doing. So we've done many versions of that. What I want to share with you today is the most recent, which is some work that we did where we went out to many, many transition groups. There are now transition groups in 50 countries around the world, thousands of communities where this happens. It's a self-organizing system. So when transition starts in Brazil, it doesn't start like a Coca-Cola franchise might, where they say, now we need an office in Brazil. It starts because someone in Brazil is inspired by it and they translate some of the materials and then they start to build a movement there. So I want to go through some of these characteristics to give you a sense of what transition is. One flavor, and Justin mentioned local currencies, of how this idea spreads is in local currencies. So when we started Transition Town Totnes, this was the very first Totnes pound that we ever made. the idea was that I'd seen in a building a framed, this was a banknote issued in 1810 by the Bank of Totnes. So we issued 300 more, and we said, and we got 18 shops to agree to accept them for 3 months to see how that went, just as an experiment. People really loved it. It inspired other places. This is Brixton in London. This is the city of Exeter's currency. This is the Bristol pound. In the end, in Totnes, until very recently, we had a £21 note, because people would say, why do you have a £21 note? And we'd say, because we can. Why not? And there was a beautiful kind of freedom to this. The idea with this is a local currency from the north of France. This is one from Switzerland. These are different French. There's many of these currencies in France. This one, which is called La Roue, is actively supported by the local municipality in a way that's really interesting. So the beauty of a movement like transition is that when one place comes up with a good idea, that idea can spread and be shared very quickly, as I will come on to say. So one of the first things that transition groups do, and I should say that these things that I'm going to share are things that the transition movement has told us. We go out to them and say, what are you doing? And this is the key thing. So one of them is engaging with the need for change. Transition groups are brilliant. This is a photograph from my town of a community event just before lockdown, where the community came together to say, okay, our local government have declared a climate emergency. What does that mean? What should we do? So with really good facilitation, a really beautifully facilitated event, hundreds of people came together to really think beyond where we might go from here. And we need to create these spaces, because government doesn't create these spaces. Local governments don't create these spaces. Imagination needs space. And as communities, we can create that, and we can educate our communities about climate change in a much better way, I think. The second one is to co-create motivating and imaginative narratives and visions. So this is a story from London, from a neighborhood in London called Tooting, which is a very diverse neighborhood in London. And it has a very busy street through the middle, lots and lots of cars. And there's nowhere that's like a community space, like a community green or a square or something. So the community came together and they said, actually, there's this place should be our square. And it's normally a place where buses wait to be called to go somewhere else. So the air is very smelly, it's not great. So one day in the summer, the community had raised about £2,000 through doing some crowdfunding. And for that one day, they took that space, normally full of buses, made all the buses go away, and they turned that space into what it would be like if it already was a village green. So they put real grass down on the ground. They filled that space with color and conversation and community and carnival and coffee and other things that start with the letter C, I don't know, and music, which doesn't start with a C. And so for the day, people were able to experience a day as if it already was that. It was beautiful. I got to sit with my feet on the real grass in that place. And over the day, what I noticed was the conversation changed from, if this was our village green, to when this is our village green. So when you hold a space with a really good what if question, and you allow people to immerse themselves in a different future, something shifts. Something changes in terms of people's sense of what might be possible. Once you see something like that, it's really hard to unsee it in that way. And I heard lots of people looking at this wall, which normally no one ever looks at, and saying, what story about ourselves will we paint on this wall when this is our village green? You know, what I see again, time and time again in transition communities is that people hold a space, people facilitate events like this that allow people's sense of how the future could be to shift and to change. This is a transition group in the southwest of England who every day for a month before I gave a talk for them posted a different what if question on social media. And they were just beautiful and really simple. What if car parks became play parks? What if birdsong became so loud that it drowned out the sound of the traffic? And I do a lot of work at the moment with community groups around asking really good what if questions, because they're like the key, I think, that opens up our ability to think about the future in different ways. What if there was a daily imagination lesson? This was the last one they posted, which I thought was really beautiful. By this point, they didn't need all the words of what if anymore. People understood the basic idea. So the third one is connecting and care for each other. One of the things that has become such an issue of life in this part of the 21st century is the rise of loneliness, the rise of isolation, the breakdown of communities and their ability to support each other. And this is a transition group in Hungary who took over this building and turned it into a community center. And so a lot of transition groups see their work as being to build new infrastructures of care in their community, particularly in nations where there is a sort of government austerity means that is being cut. And communities are stepping in and providing that kind of care and support. This is in Los Angeles, Transition Pasadena, who started a repair cafe in the back of a local church. They run 13 repair cafes every year. They have NASA and Caltech very near to where they are. So they get incredible people who will come and repair things. So you could bring your iPad, your phone, your curtains, your shoes, and somebody will repair it for free. But they say there's one condition. The condition is that while they repair it, you sit in a chair opposite them and you tell them a story about your life. So I always wonder, in this time of an epidemic of loneliness, what are they really repairing? What are they really fixing at the Pasadena Repair Cafe? And the transition movement is full of stories like this. This is a town in Wales where they noticed the decline, that they noticed the amount of perfectly good food that local shops were throwing away. So they started a community cafe where they would use that food to make meals, affordable meals for people on low income, and also train local young people who wanted to learn how to cook professionally. And it became such an important social place for people to meet, and people who were isolated to meet with each other and to talk with each other. These things are something that communities can do beautifully, I think. And this is in the north of England, where the council owned a farm. It was kind of run down. Nobody really cared about it very much, and they wanted to sell it. So the community bought the farm from the local government, and the community run it as what they call a care farm. So they run lots of they run lots of services from there, which provide care for the most vulnerable people in that community, but always in the context of growing food, learning skills, learning how to cook. And these again are things that communities can do beautifully. One of the fundamental ideas of transition is that resources flow through a town, through a city. Money comes into it from pensions and government and where our wages or whatever, and then most of it leaves again, because we shop in the supermarket, it disappears. We go to a big chain coffee shop, that money leaves. We buy our book on Amazon rather than a local bookshop, that money leaves. And our economy is a very extractive economy, which takes money away and the power that goes with that money as well. In transition, we say the more that we can redesign our local economy so that money stays locally and circulates as many times as possible, which was the idea of local currencies, because you can only spend that in Totnes, you can't spend it anywhere else, is a really powerful economic idea. And there are now cities where that is the fundamental economic idea of the local government. How do we make sure money can circulate as many times as possible in the local economy? And that needs new organizations, new institutions, and new approaches. This is, again, a community garden in Italy, where started by the transition group that brings local community together in that context of care. Another aspect of the transition movement that's really, really important is what we call inner transition. So this is the logo from Belgium, from the transition group there, who focus on what we call inner transition. So inner transition is the part of this which says that how we do this work matters as much as what we do. If as a community you form a group to do transition, you are going to find that you need the skills to run good meetings, to manage conflict, to minimize the risk of burnout, to design meetings that people want to come to support people through moments of grief and despair. And so there is a whole toolkit of approaches that we call inner transition, which is fundamentally important to this process too. So when people do our 2-day training for how to start a transition group, they might expect that it's all about, you know, how to print your own money and how to start a solar energy co-op or something. Actually, most of the training is about what we call inner transition. So it's about those skills that we need, the soft skills, if you like, the kind of social technologies that we need in order for this to work. One example is that in my town, we have many psychotherapists and counselors in the community in our town. So one of the things that they offer is a mentoring approach. So anybody who is working at the heart of transition in our town can get free counseling, free support whenever they need it. And it has made such a difference. And speaking personally, there have been a few times when the work I've been doing has become too intense or overwhelming, and being able to have that kind of support has made a huge difference in terms of reducing my risk of burnout. So this is not just a physical process of meeting as colleagues to put solar panels everywhere. The inner aspect of this is really important as well. The fifth one is about injustice and addressing injustice. And this is a transition group from the US, a town called Humboldt. And for them, social justice is fundamental to what they do. So this is them, for example, where they do these events where they work with a low-income family who have a front yard, who want to grow food, and the transition group will mobilize a lot of people who one Saturday will go and in a day will transform that garden and turn it into a food garden. You know, transition groups can do that. You can mobilize a lot of people to do something, and it's amazing what a lot of people can do in a short period of time. But this underpinning of the work that we do, with the motivation around social justice and trying to make what we do as inclusive as possible, and designing the work we do at the community scale to address the real needs of that community, are fundamentally important to what we do. So this is a project, that's me there at the front, a few years ago, looking a lot younger. This is a project that I've been part of for a long time now, about 13 years, which is called Atmos, which is where the community is trying to become its own developer. So this is a factory, an empty factory in the center of our town, which the community organized to become the developer of, because private market-led housing has completely failed this town and not provided what we need. And so we campaigned very hard to become the developer of the site. We ran a community consultation in a town of 9,000 people that heard from more than 4,000 people. And based on that input and on a 1.5-year process of consultation, we created this master plan for the site, which is based on what the town told us that it needed. And we are now fighting very hard in a big campaign to become the owners of the site. It's a complicated story, but what is essential to it is that this idea that why should development just be something that is done by private developers for profit, which is about meeting their needs, not meeting the needs of the community. So communities can become their own developers. Communities can become their own energy companies. And the beautiful thing about the model for this project is that all the money that is generated through the income from the rent, from the different buildings, will go back into this community. Rather than being taken away to some big company somewhere, it will stay locally. And if we're talking about building resilient communities, the more we are able to keep money circulating locally and staying locally, the more resilient we become, the more democratic we become, the more in control of our own future we become as well. Another one is about applying living systems design, by which I mean, because I was a teacher of permaculture for many years, and which is all about how do we learn from the models of nature about how we design new things. So in Luxembourg, the transition movement in Luxembourg is very actively supported by the national government. They have about 20 people who work for Transition Luxembourg, who are supporting a whole range of different projects all across the country. It's very, very inspiring. One of the things they're doing is building this building, which is called an earthship, which you may have seen, where people build walls using old car tires and then using all ecological materials inside. This will be a national training center for sustainability, but it's all based on learning from ecological design principles. How does nature do things, and how do we learn from that? And the whole architecture of this building is designed around creating an ecosystem like that. This is a story that I love from a town close to where I live called Wellington. And when we read climate science, we often see this idea of what are called positive feedbacks. So one thing happens, and they tend to not be very positive, right? Positive feedbacks tends to be, it gets warmer, so the ice melts, so there's more dark sea. The dark absorbs more heat, so the water gets warmer, so the ice melts quicker, and you get these feedbacks like this. I think it's really important to recognize that that we can also get positive feedbacks in community change. That once you support communities to start doing things, and they do one thing and it works, it gives them confidence to think, well, if we did that, what else could we do? And it grows and it builds. So in Wellington, the community started a small community garden, which was really popular, and loads of people got involved, and it was very successful. So then then someone said, well, what about this piece of land here behind people's houses? What could you do there? So they cleared all the grass, they turned it into a food forest. It was really successful. People really loved it. Then their local council said, look, we have this 3-hectare piece of land here. What could you do with that? So they ran a big consultation. They learned how to do good community consultation. They used the empty shops on the high street to advertise it. They designed this landscape, which is now being planted. And then their local council said, we have this 13-hectare strip around this part of the city. Could you create a green corridor? So they're now working to do that. So this idea, community change can build and build and build in its impact. But for me, one of the most inspiring stories that has come through the transition movement is from the city of Liège in Belgium. And what's really important, I think, to say is when you look at the transition movement, the work that transition groups do can be really small. It could just be they plant some trees, or they make a garden in the street, or it can be really ambitious like what's happening in Liège, and they're all as important as each other. For me, there's not a sense of these big ones matter more, because all of them are important in different ways. But what happened in Liège was that in 2014, the community said, what if in a generation's time, the majority of food eaten in Liège came from the land closest to Liège? Which is such a beautiful question, because it invites people to dream differently and to think about the future in a very different way. And so they started this project. I was there for the beginning of it when they launched it. And then I went back 4 years later. The name means the Liège Food Belt is what it means. So I went back after 4 years. And in that time, they'd started 27 new cooperatives in Liège, all in community ownership. And they raised 5 million euros to start these businesses, not from the bank, not from the municipality, from people in the city investing into those cooperatives. They started a farm, 2 vineyards, a brewery. They started a shop called the Small Producers in the center of the city, which was now doing so well that they've opened another 4. This is now the model that the municipality in the city is using to reinvent how it provides food for local schools, local universities, local hospitals. This is a profoundly transformative thing, which started with the community. When I met the mayor of Liège, he said, we used to say we wanted to be a smart city. Now we want to be a transition city. This is the future of this city. So what we're seeing in Belgium is this idea is now spreading to many other cities in Belgium and also into France. I went to Marseille in the south of France, where the mayor said to me that before we have a contract with Sodexo, like a big company who provide food for hospitals and universities. We've told them when their contract ends in 3 years, that's the end. And we are buying land all around Marseille to build a new food system to provide that food. This is the story of the future. But the beauty of it in Liège is the community came up with the idea. The community started it. For the first 2 years, the municipality thought they were completely mad. And then the municipality said to them, this is great. How can we help? Tell us what the blockages are and we will remove them, which feels to me like a really healthy way to move into the future. The next one is about just doing things. Justin mentioned that the title of my book was The Power of Just Doing Stuff. I think that supporting and inspiring communities to come together and do things is really important. This is in Brussels, in a neighborhood in Brussels where there is a lot of prostitution and antisocial behavior, and these streets are not necessarily are difficult places for communities to live next to. So one day the local council you can just see in the bottom corner these 2 concrete blocks to stop men driving up and down all night in this neighborhood. The community said, well, we could do better than that. Can we make a garden? So the community came together and they built this garden, and 13 families on this street have a little patch in this garden. And what they found was that it brought this street back to life. It created a safe space for people to meet each other. It meant that children could play in the street again for the first time. Little projects like this can actually have huge impacts and give people a sense of being part of trying to change things. This is in London, where Transition Brixton started a community energy company, and that community energy company invited people in these neighborhoods to invest in putting renewable energy on some of the poorest housing in the city. This model now has spread across London. It's really having a huge impact. When we come together as communities, we can create benefits for the community, which kind of top-down approaches just can't do. And we create a social coming together of people that is really powerful. The way I like to think about it is if we want to create a new coral reef, we're seeing many coral reefs around the world struggling. So people say, okay, we need to build a new coral reef. How do you build a coral reef? You don't breed coral. What you do is you create something that the coral can form onto. So often they put loads of old cars in a particular place, and what you do is you create a structure and a surface area that then the coral can form around. So in transition, what we do is to try and create projects like this that gives the opportunity for the community to organize around. And Justin mentioned the brewery that I'm part of. And again, for me, that's a beautiful aspect of that. We'll create a brewery, we'll create a bar, and actually it will become a place that community and many other things can then form around. But communities can create those things, I think, far better than local government can. One of the beautiful things about the transition movement is that when one community comes up with a good idea, it can be spread and it can replicate. So one thing that was created in my town is something called transition streets. And the idea of transition streets is very simple, and I'm sure is just as relevant in Singapore as it is in Totnes, which is if you want to support communities to reduce their water use, their energy use, to support local business, to use their car less, how do you do that? What do you do? Do you send them a DVD in the post? I mean, how does that work? So the idea with transition streets is you create a process where people meet on their streets in groups of 6 to 10 neighbors, and they meet 7 times. You give them a workbook, you facilitate their first meeting with them. The first week they look at energy, the second week they look at waste, third week they look at water, and so on. We ran it in my town, and 550 households took part, and on average they cut their carbon footprint by 1.3 tons per house, and the UK average I think is about 9 tons per house. What was most interesting with the research afterwards was that when people were asked what were the benefits they felt from being part of this, nobody mentioned the carbon, nobody mentioned the money they had saved. Everybody said, I know my neighbors better. I feel part of my community. I feel if something went wrong, I would know where to go. Many groups, after the 7 weeks were finished, carried on meeting and created all kinds of projects. The thing that I love was that this was developed for my town here in Totnes. It's now spread to many, many other places. This is 2 towns in New Zealand, Banyule and Newcastle, who work together to create transition streets, to adapt transition streets to their context. There is a transition streets for Belgium. It's being run in many cities in America. When you create that kind of a network, this kind of sharing happens, and it's beautiful to see. Also, it's important to notice, I think, that many people who are involved in transition, well, some people who are involved in transition also tend to bring that spirit into more activist kind of settings as well. So this is in 2019 when the Extinction Rebellion climate movement launched for the first time in London, and a group of activists, quite a lot of whom were from Totnes and from places like that, took this bridge, Waterloo Bridge in London, and turned it into a forest. They put trees all down the middle. Normally this bridge is full of cars. For 2 weeks, they managed to stop the police taking the bridge back again, and they turned it into a forest. And it was a very powerful experience for many people who visited. You know, that doing the kind of transition work, for me, that kind of activist community resilience building work is as political, and for me is just as radical as the kind of work that movements like Extinction Rebellion do around climate change. And sometimes it's the same people that you can be involved in that more kind of confrontational activism, and at the same time you're also involved working at your community scale, starting a brewery or whatever it is that you want to do. Getting really good at helping people to participate and getting involved is also a really important piece of this. And this is Transition Tooting in London, again, who are brilliant at using art and really creative projects to engage the diversity of their community. This was when they did a thing called the Tooting Transition Shop, where they took over an empty shop and turned it into what they called a place with nothing for sale but lots on offer, where people could just come in and talk and share their hopes and their fears and their dreams. And we need to create kind of spaces like this, I think, where we can really bring the diversity of our communities together. One of the first things they did was to walk around all the different places of worship in their neighborhoods to hear from those communities how they approach how they talk about care of the earth. And those networks that they built were really important in their work going forward. This is something which is too hard to read, but the principle of it is this is them mapping their web of relationships that they have built in their community and how that has led to different projects. So they started working with the local mosque, and then they were working on this project, and then they did a community art project, and then that introduced them to these people. Transition is not a kind of a linear process. You do this, this happens, this happens. It's not like a campaigning organization where you can say, well, if we raise £1 million, we can reach 10 million people with our message. It's a process that is much more based around self-organization. I like to think of it as being like you inoculate a community almost with a fungus, with a kind of mycorrhiza, which spreads. Its roots run, and sometimes you can see them and sometimes you can't. And so we see that now the transition movement, something we designed to be run by communities, being catalyzed by local government, by mayors. There are some businesses who see themselves very much as being transition businesses. And this way that transition spreads and inspires people and inspires projects, for me, is one of the most fascinating and kind of under-researched parts of this. So the last one I want to share with you, and then we'll move and open this out, is about building networks and alliances. And so transition is not something that happens in isolation. It's something that really flourishes by building more and more networks and connections. This is Transition Toronto in Canada, who run a project called Treemobile, where they buy productive trees in bulk, and then people buy them from them, and they go out and plant the trees with them. So they have a whole team of volunteers. The trees are delivered by bicycle to people's houses and then planted. And in effect, what they've been doing for the last 10 years is creating a food forest in Toronto, but kind of distributed in lots of people's places, in gardens, in school grounds. But just working away quietly every year, planting hundreds more trees with volunteers and using a whole lots of different networks. So they work together with lots of different groups, and that's where the resilience of what they do comes from. What we see happening as well is, as I mentioned, lots of local governments gets very inspired by transition. They get very excited by this idea, and they are also looking for ways in which they can connect better with neighborhoods, with community groups. And the community groups as well, when they start transition, they very rapidly realize, yeah, we're going to need the government. We're going to need our city government if this is going to work. So this is a project called Municipalities in Transition, which you can find online and which is working in, I think, 10 or 11 different countries now to really explore that piece of where local government and communities meet and how that happens in the most effective way possible. And there are many great stories and case studies that you can find there about how this works. So sometimes I visit places where transition is being designed and led by the community and sometimes by the municipality. And how do we do that better? This is a community energy company in the city of Bath in the southwest of England, who again, it started as a community project. They've raised about £15 million worth of investment from local people investing into renewable energy, into a cooperative, which is in community ownership, and the benefits go to the community. It inspired their municipality, who have invested £3 or £4 million into this as well. So you start to see what it looks like when communities start things and municipalities come in to support and to work alongside this kind of approach. One of the big challenges, I started this by talking about the imagination, and I want to finish by talking about the imagination as well. This is, I think, one of the problems that we have is that there's a part of our brain called the hippocampus, which is kind of in the middle here, which is where our imagination and our memory both fire from. And I feel like in 2022, we have created an economy which is really damaging to the hippocampus. We know that cortisol, the hormone that is released when we are anxious or stressed or in trauma, causes the hippocampus to shrink by up to 20%. And when that happens, we lose the ability to think about the future in positive and hopeful ways, and we get stuck in the past. I wanted to find somewhere that was creating the conditions for the hippocampus to grow back. So I went to Dundee to this amazing project run by this woman called Rosalie Somerton. They work with people with mental health problems, burnout, trauma. They say, when you come here, you're an artist preparing work for an exhibition, and every year they put on an exhibition. And I spoke to so many people about their experiences there. And every year, in order to evaluate how well they're doing, they give their artists a piece of paper with 2 outlines of a human body. They say, fill the first one to show how you felt before you came here, fill the second to show how you feel now you've been coming here for a while. And I looked through a big pile of these, and it really was a strong indicator of the work they do. I just want to share one with you, because I feel like, firstly, this picture for me represents what it feels like when we are able to connect with our imagination again. What would it feel like if our collective hippocampus was able to grow back? But also, it's if we are to do everything that we need to do in the next 10 years, which the climate scientists demand of us, it will feel like we lived through a revolution of the imagination. And what would it feel like to live through a revolution of the imagination? I have no idea, because there's never been one in my lifetime. But I think it would feel like this. This is the picture that kind of underpins all of the work that I do. And for me, what I've seen time and time again in communities is when they can organize, and when they can be supported to do that, and when they can create projects that are ambitious and led by them, that it feels like this. And we need to be giving people that experience, I think. So I just want to finish with a little short video. It's about 2 minutes long. I think it has French subtitles, which are probably not much use to you. But this is a video that I made when my last book came out, which was me taking a walk around a day in the life in 2030. And so you might just allow your imagination to imagine that you have stepped forward 8 years and you're taking a walk around in a future that could be created if we did everything that we possibly could do.
This is my apartment. I wake up here and get my kids up ready for school. Come on, kids! These apartments were built 14 years ago with straw bale walls and using local materials. They're incredibly energy efficient, and the composting toilets in the basement mean that we now use a fraction of the water that we used to use in 2019. The streets are quiet due to sparse motorised traffic, aligned with fruit and nut trees. There are food gardens everywhere, and the air smells like spring. I drop my kids at school. Bye kids, see you later. School is now very different from 15 years ago. Testing was eliminated, play is encouraged, and the great reskilling means that kids can now turn their hands to pretty much anything. I call in to buy bread at my favourite bakery. This place was set up in 2022 as part of a citywide holistic mental health strategy based on the idea that baking is the new Prozac. I pass former supermarkets, now repurposed as a flourishing mix of local enterprises. Many of the enterprises here are run by people who arrived during the time of the Great Migrations and who are now so fully integrated it's really hard to remember life before they came. I walk down streets full of children playing, neighbours in conversation, people growing food everywhere. Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, absolutely. I visit a meeting run by our municipalities' Civic Imagination Office, which has transformed local democracy and what feels possible to us as citizens of this place. As the day draws to a close, I notice the hooting of owls and the swooping of the bats, just two of the indicators that the biodiversity of this place is really starting to bounce back.
So that's what I wanted to share with you, and I hope this has been a useful contribution, and I think we have some time for questions in a little while. But yeah, thank you very much for your attention, and I hope this has been useful.
Thank you so much, Rob. I mean, I've been, as I was listening to this, I feel like itching to go out and just do something. And my phone has been, uh, people have been discussing already on my phone. So before we move on to the actual discussions, I would like to invite my friends from Tote Board to kind of comment on it, because they've been commenting in the WhatsApp chat. So would Xiao Kun like to say something first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, just to add in a bit, even within Tote Board, we may actually be split. I'm actually more enthusiastic about. I think just listening to Rob's examples that you have cited, and about how all these are real life examples. They're not at the theory level. Yeah, because we actually have no dearth of ideas. Lots of people have many ideas, but how do you find the people on the ground, right? To make the idea a reality. Yeah, because we have we basically have a lot of agency coming to us to say, oh, we want to be the backbone for this, we want to be a backbone for that. Yeah, but it's actually not really just for the pure backbone pulling things together. The question is what you say, it's not linear, right? It's going to be like a network. How do you guys find the right people to or right optimal number of critical mass of people to get that happening, to keep it rolling lah. Yeah, so I thought that was quite inspirational. Yeah, except of course, I mean, Singapore is really small. I don't think we can develop a currency just for Serangoon and then a currency for Hougang. It won't work this way because we're really small. So even the community currency idea is also something I thought was quite interesting. Yeah, I mean, here I can also make a plug for one of the grants that actually Tote Board, IPS and LKYCIC were putting together something lah. Yeah, for a future ready society. We want to support some of these interesting ideas. And so I mean, to the 80 plus participants who are on this, one of the things that we also have been thinking about is actually how can we test and run some of these ideas lah. So actually the question to Rob is actually more, how do you get it happening? Is it that organic? Yeah, because I mean, some of us have even thought hey, Singaporeans a bit practical, and you sure we want to spend my time doing this kind of stuff for the community? Yeah, how do you guys do it? Yeah, how do you bring the idea to fruition? Yeah,
I think so the first thing to say is that we have, so if people look at transitionnetwork.org, the website, at the bottom of the page there is a link to a guide called the manual of it's called the Essential Guide to Doing Transition, which is really our distilled everything that we've learned so far about how to start it. It's kind of the guide to get going. I think usually we need to make, yeah, thank you, Jacinta. So I think we have to make this feel like the most fun party in town. If we're going to try and do this with a feeling that it's like a long walk home in the rain, it's just never going to happen. This has to feel like the best thing. So we often would have using tools like open space technology, which is a beautiful way of facilitating big events in a way that's self-organizing. And I've seen many of those happen that lead to many projects, because you create the opportunity for people to meet the other people who care about that thing. There's lots of people in every neighborhood. There'll be lots of people who are sitting thinking, oh, wouldn't it be great if we had more food growing in our neighborhood? But they don't know anyone else who thinks that too. Or they might be thinking, wouldn't it be great if we had a community energy company? They don't know anybody else. So you have to create the event where those people come together and they're like, oh, I thought I was the only person who cared about this, and you care about it too. That's so exciting. And lots of transition groups start as well with showing a really inspiring film like the French film Tomorrow, or a film which tells a different story, sharing stories of what's happening in other places. And then to do something, even a small project that gives people a first taste of it. I would say, if after 6 months you're still just talking, that's not good. It needs to turn into something happening really quickly. I remember a woman from Australia once contacted Transition Network, and she said, I love transition. It's so inspiring. I'd love transition to happen in my town, but I am the only person in my town who cares about transition. And we said, are you? How do you know that? And so she then went and wrote, she put an advert in her local newspaper to say, hello, my name is Sarah and I am really interested in transition. She wrote to us later and said, I got 140 replies and now we have a transition group. So it's about creating the the opportunity for those people to meet each other, which could be a big event, it could be a bbig party. There's lots of different ways that that could be done.
Yeah, yeah, and also sustaining it, right? It's also like, yeah, because I mean, as you were talking about how it has to be a social movement. I mean, almost like you have to make it a party that people want to be part of. Yeah, sometimes I also wonder, like, as you know, part of government, whenever we fund something, people will be like, government, then they will like move out of it. Yeah. So I mean, we work with our partners to see how we can like try to make this potentially happen. I'm also happy to hear the views from the people who are attending this. I mean, since you guys are here, because you guys are interested in this. Yeah, because one of the things I also been thinking about, the example you use about how some of the communities came together to buy over to save the pub or to save like certain area and come together. I mean, recently the big news was like, you know, somewhere in Tampines or something, there was some coffee shop that was sold for like $41 million or something, and then subsequently they raised the rent so high that like the stores went away. So I mean, these are like well located coffee shop. I also wonder if like it could be something the community buys it up and then you create like jobs for people within the community. I mean, something you think about lah. So I thought like one of the, I mean, as you shared the stories that you shared, it made me think about like, things can be different, right? Yeah. But how do we get to us to a point where it's like like what you say at the end of the video, these are not just ideas, they are real, right? How do we get there? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think just to say quickly, one of the things that is really that can be really transformative in this is when you, and I mentioned it in the context of Liège, is when you involve universities and hospitals and schools and what are often called the anchor institutions in an economy to use their money in a different way. So the best known example is in Cleveland in Ohio in America, where they created what's called the evergreen co-ops. So in a poor neighborhood in Cleveland, the hospital created a new cooperative to do the laundry for the hospital, to provide the food for the hospital, and to provide the energy for the hospital. And it led to a completely different approach where that money stayed locally rather than leaving, and it led to many, many benefits. So if we can get those institutions on board and supportive of this process, it starts to get very interesting.
Thank you, Rob. I would like now to invite our discussants. Maybe Ms. Elaine Tan can go first. She's director of the research for Center for Livable Cities. And just before this, we were having a chat about is transitions new? You know, there seems to be lots of movements in Singapore, and we do this, right? So when I talk about community currencies, people say, "Oh, we have the CDC vouchers." Then and Rob mentioned the repair cafes, and oh, we have repair kopitiam, and we have all this, you know, community gardens and all that. What's new? And it seems in my mind that surely we have visibly these things exist in Singapore, but we're discussing, is it really the same how we do things here? Is it really communities coming to do it, or some non-profit doing it and leading the communities instead of communities themselves doing it? I don't know, I'm not sure. Elaine, would you like to reflect on Rob's sharing, please?
Hi, all right. Hi, everybody. Thanks, Justin. I think there are two things that you're asking me here. One is the reflection, and the other one was probably a question on, so what are we doing vis-a-vis what we have seen Rob share? Maybe just my response. I think what Rob has done is absolutely wonderful. It's definitely bringing a new angle to how we can solve issues that are challenges that will affect all of us. And all of us means that it's not just it's a public or private issue, but it's public, private, and people sectors as well. And that's where the community and the transition movement plays a huge role. So that said, I think it's great to see that we are looking at it at a slice of our society that hasn't been at the forefront for a very long time, just because that we are in that process of Rob's earlier slides. We are in the process of becoming a more and more organized society. So having this, bringing this discussion about communities to the forefront is definitely the right direction. That said, I believe that whatever we are doing to solve any problems definitely is a whole of society approach. And I think, as Rob said, he used to be in permaculture and he takes inspiration from nature. Then indeed, we are all part of an ecosystem. So it's not just about who's doing what, who's doing more, but to really see that as an ecosystem, everybody has a role to play, and we're all playing different roles, and we can only be stronger, better, more resilient, because the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And I think that's a very strong spirit that we are discussing here today. I also see what Rob has mentioned about the projects that have been done, that it is not about big or small projects. I think very often we may get caught up with the idea that every project has to be a broad gesture. It has to be absolutely impactful. It has to be making it to the headlines. But I think very importantly, especially with community efforts, is that we see every effort as equal, just like as Rob mentioned, big or small, and we should celebrate the small wins, because it is the small wins that the community have that will inspire them, that will motivate them, and will drive them to do even more. And I think that is the first step to give people confidence, to build that confidence, engender that sense of pride, and of course, the ability to continue to want to do more. So it doesn't stop at one pilot or one effort, but it can be scaled up and become something that would therefore then reach that impact that everybody is talking about. I absolutely also love what Rob mentioned in some of his projects, and what really inspired me most, and I think is the greatest challenge of all, is that sustainable financing model that has been developed in some of his projects. Because very often community efforts could be one-off, it could fizzle out, it could be changing because of the different people or champions that are involved in the project. And I see some of the projects that have actually developed a viable business model that can actually lead to a core team. And I think one of his slides, he showed that there are actually full-time staff of the transition movement that are there to continue to spearhead and to shepherd the efforts. I think that is extremely important, because it is not about just a transition, but it is about going into a longer term sustainability model. And I think sustainability in itself and resilience already encapsulate a very long-term view to things. So that would be some of the areas that refinancing and a business model, the sustainability, the viability is something that I'd like to learn more from Rob about. Yeah, thanks. That's my reflection.
Thank you, Elaine. Next, I'd like to invite Habib Neo, a senior fellow at the Lee Kuan Yew's Center for Innovative Cities. He was formerly from NUS. He was associate professor here. And even though he left and betrayed us, we're still friends with him. But he's leading this Future of Asian Studies project. And I was curious whether, Harvey, you've seen or heard about transitions as you are studying all these Asian cities. And what do you think also maybe of whether in Singapore, because the skeptics in the room feel that Singaporeans, they will never be mobilized or be motivated to do this, right? We're always waiting for government to do it, or we are waiting for the non-profits to do something, right? But communities as a whole are dead, and we just kind of, the middle classes just buy things to satisfy our needs. Do you think that have you seen this, and do you think that Singaporeans are mobilizable in that sense? Harvey?
Okay, thank you, Justin, and thank you, Rob, for this very clear introduction to Transition Town. And to answer Justin's question, yes, I have heard of transition movement, Transition Town, and in my former life as a teaching slave in NUS, I did teach students about this, and I kind of position transition movement and its ideas as something that is a bit far within our reach in the context of Singapore, right? So it is a dream that I sell to them, and I feel that it should rightly call a dream, because that's doing full justice to the transition movement. So if it's a dream, then we have to really reach out to achieve this dream. It's not something that we can do as a matter of ease and convenience and comfort. So to achieve your dream, you do have to make sacrifices. You do have to be a little bit clever, a little bit sneaky even, to see how we might go about seeding this dream. So that in itself would kind of summarize my overall sense of the transition movement. I think of it very fondly. I think it's a good idea. I think it's many ideas actually encapsulated into one idea. And that brings me to my first point about Rob's presentation, and not just transition movement in general, but selling a dream to people. And I agree fully with Rob that you need a narrative. You need a meaningful narrative that speaks to people. That in itself is commonsensical. Unfortunately, because we are dealing with people who are of different ilks, different groups, status, different ethics, different way of life, this narrative necessarily must be malleable enough, right? Because what is a meaningful narrative to me might not resonate with many other people. So that in itself is the challenge of finding a narrative that speaks to everyone, literally. Of course, you can repackage the same message differently to different groups of people, and that's what some people do. But we would have to see whether that will actually be worthwhile. So unfortunately, that is just the first hurdle we need to cross, because the meaningful narrative in my mind would only be successful in attracting the ears and eyes of the people in the first instance. In other words, it's the first step necessary to not put them off, to actually encourage them to sit down and listen to you for more than like 10 seconds. So that meaningful narrative is just the first step. How do we sustain this interest? Or, more challengingly, how do we make this interest into actual action? And I think both Justin and Elaine mentioned this, and Rob suggested some kind of solutions, which is really to start small. And these are all good and fine, and I agree with all the suggestions. So for sustained change, I believe we do need to go beyond just the ears and the eyes of people. We need to arrest their hearts and their minds to, the thinking and the feeling. And regardless what kind of big dream that we are selling, that is kind of resting very awkwardly within the context of your society, what we need to do is to get people to think more about the future. And I think this Rob has mentioned, not just to think about future like thinking, but think about the future in a way that is, for the lack of better words, sensible. And that means to really see to it that the future that you're thinking is not one of complete biasness, is not one of you unwilling to see the reality that is going to unfold. So it is a combination of your personal character and the science and the facts that we have at the present moment to think about the future in a sensible way. So this time perspective, I think, is something important to inculcate. Because if I have this meaningful narrative, I have all hearts and mind into it, but somehow I think of the future in a very different way. Say I would think of the future, and this can be good or bad. I could think of a future where, 30 years later, the world will just spontaneously explode. Then I would withdraw. I would not necessarily do anything, because that would be the sensible way to react to this kind of scenario. There is no point in doing it. And there are many people who, think along those lines, not necessarily that 30 years later, Earth will combust. So that's the importance of time perspective, thinking about the future sensibly. And the last skill set, or thought set, if you like, that I thought is important, and I believe this resonates with Elaine's ecosystem point, is this sense of responsibility. So more than just that, there is this need for each person to internalize this sense of responsibility, what I call a self-responsible behavior. So you have to start with yourself. So again, marrying all the previous perspective, if you have the right meaningful narrative, you have the hearts and minds into it, you have the correct time perspective, but actually you don't really feel like you're very responsible about all this. You can feel that, I'm quite comfortable now, I know Earth is going zoom, but I don't really care because, I'm me, I have all kinds of resources at hand. So you don't actually cultivate a sense of responsibility that is extending outwards from yourself to your family, community, Earth, whatever. So there is an ecosystem idea that's missing here. So time perspective, responsibilization. The one thing that I thought I should raise is, it's not really a criticism per se, but it is something that I think policymakers would want to ask. And I know they ask the most annoying and inconvenient questions. But in this case, I thought it would be a useful question to ask, which is, are virtuous outcomes accumulative? I know Rob seems to suggest that this is not the crucial question to ask, or that by implication, he thinks that it is many little drops make a big ocean, that kind of thing. But then there are a school of thought which believe that, a single swallow doesn't a summer make. So we are dealing with very real opposing ends, opposing sides in looking at such phenomena. So our virtuous outcomes are cumulative. If we criticize neoliberal economy as a false notion of an economy whose benefits will trickle down from the top to the bottom, then we can rightly ask whether such initiatives, what I call perhaps a moral economy, can goodness aggregate upwards then? I'm not sure. So this is a legitimate question to ask. And that kind of question will lead to policymakers asking full-on questions, So what kinds of politics, place, and people for what kind of transition? And put it another way, what kind of politics, place, and people will have nothing to do with transition? I think these are all pretty valid questions that policymakers are much more interested in asking than me, myself. I don't really care. That's my response.
Thanks, Avi. Rob, did you want an opportunity to respond to either of the reflections?
Yeah, I mean, I guess picking up on what Justin was saying there, my observation in Totnes is that, like that quote that I used from the Institute for the Future, any idea about the future should at first seem ridiculous. When we started doing transition here, most people thought we were completely mad. I remember speaking to the mayor at the time, who said, when I first spoke to Rob, when he came up with this idea of transition, I thought he was completely mad. And now 10 years later, I know he was completely mad. And actually recently she wrote me an email with the energy crisis happening in Europe because of the war in Ukraine. And she said, actually, Rob, you weren't mad. It's like, well, I always knew I wasn't mad, but thank you. It's nice to hear that. And I think what we've seen here is really an idea which starts as a community thing with small projects, and people can then dismiss it and they can say, yeah, well, how is planting a few trees going to save the planet? And then then there's a community energy forms, and people start to invest in the community energy company, and people can still say, yeah, but it's only a few solar panels on a few buildings. How is that going to save the world? And then the community becomes its own developer on an 8-acre-old factory site in a way that could happen across the country and could transform the way that brownfield sites are approached with a completely different model of development. People can still say, well, yeah, but it's just in Totnes. But then actually, when you see this model spreading, like the Liège example with the food belt, which started in one little town, is now spreading to many, many towns and cities across Belgium, is now spreading into France, is inspiring people in other places too. I never for a moment would say that transition is the only thing that we need, partly because I would never want to put that level of pressure onto communities. It's like, oh, well, neoliberal capitalism has made an enormous mess of everything. But hey, communities, you can sort it all out yourselves. That's not it for a moment, but it is a piece of the jigsaw puzzle, which is potentially transformative, because what it does is it creates stories that won't come from anywhere else, and that could be adopted really quickly. If the government in Singapore was to decide, this is a climate emergency and we need to reimagine the way that our universities and schools and hospitals feed themselves in a way where we create a lot more jobs, we create a lot more health and well-being, we create much more biodiversity, we create more opportunities for local business, for people to create new enterprises. That could easily be done. And the fact is that now there are examples that you can point to of this working in other places in the world because of activists working at a community scale who just said, should we do it then? Yeah, okay, let's do it. And those stories and what they have shown is possible is so powerful and important, I think. And I think, just to pick up on something else that Harvey said, I think that one of the, or maybe it was something that Elaine said actually, was that for me, one of the things that was a big shift in the transition movement was maybe the first 4 or 5 years, we would maybe, I guess, have worked in a way, we didn't talk about business very much. We talked about communities organizing. And it became very clear that if transition groups wanted to achieve what they wanted to achieve, that they needed to do that by mobilizing, but by creating new enterprises. We needed to think like an entrepreneur thinks. We needed to not think. So we mentioned the brewery that I'm involved with a few times because it's amazing, but because one of the things that was great about that for me, that was one of the first projects where we could have said, we're going to start a kind of volunteer community brewing project and work with volunteers and give the beer away for free or something like that. Actually, we said, we want to create a commercially viable brewery that will create as many jobs as possible. And we now employ about 12 people who can pay their mortgage and feed their children. And that's really important. And a while ago, I was part of an online event with an amazing woman from Richmond, California, which is a very poor neighborhood, very difficult. And she runs an amazing project there, training young people to grow food. She's been running it for 20 years. There are many, many young people there now who've started new food businesses. And I said this, you know, that we need to be bringing an entrepreneur's mind to this. We have to create jobs. We have to be the biggest creator of new jobs in our towns and our cities, which we could be. If we did transition properly, we should be the biggest growth area in the economy, is around creating jobs around this, around local food. We need businesses who are providing a service to our municipalities of taking up tarmac and taking up concrete and creating different landscapes, because we know that we have to do that because of climate change. We should have new businesses who are creating new food systems, creating new educational models. There's so much that we could be doing, but we need to do that with a kind of an entrepreneur's mind, I think. And she said, it's so important to hear that, because in my community, if this is a revolution that depends on volunteers, I can't be part of it, and nor can anybody where in my neighborhood. So creating a kind of a social economy, a kind of radical imagination economy is fundamental to this, I think.
Thank you, Rob. In relation to that, I wonder if you could address, because a lot of the participants in today's session come from nonprofits or social service agencies, and their main business is to provide a service to marginalized groups, right? Ex-offenders, disability, etc. And so they might have some kind of community engagement, but not a whole lot. There are a couple that do community work, community development as their reason for existence, but most nonprofits in the room are actually service providers. And it sounds like transition is something that a citizen could do, someone in my neighborhood. I could mobilize my neighbors. But what do you think is the role of a nonprofit leader or practitioner in this space?
So the first thing I want to say is I've never been to Singapore, and so I'm completely coming from outside. So anything that I've said here, there's no kind of implied criticism of what people are doing at the moment and how people are working, because we're all working very hard to do what it is that we feel we need to do. So but the important thing, I think, is that this kind of vision that we need to move towards an economy which is based on the idea of making sure that resources and money in particular are able to circulate locally as much as possible. It's why on the £10 note that the Bristol pound have, in very tiny writing, it says keeping money out of the Cayman Islands since 2012, because you can't take that to a tax haven. You know, Vladimir Putin can't get his hands on this. This can't go to like I don't know, wherever. It can only stay locally and make things happen. And you don't need a local currency to do that, but that principle is really, really important. So how can an organization working in a neighborhood, maybe providing social care in a neighborhood, how could that organization maybe think, yeah, how could we become, who could we collaborate with to, because it doesn't matter where this starts. Yeah, it was a big journey for me. Was we started, when we designed the transition model, we designed something to work at a community scale. What can communities do? How can we organize as citizens? That was the model for maybe the first 8 or 9 years. Then I got a phone call from this town in the northeast of France called Ungersheim, where the mayor had started doing transition. I thought, ooh, I'm not sure about this. This sounds a bit suspect. Is this still transition if it's done by the mayor? And so I went to visit it, and it was just extraordinary. And the work that they were doing there and engaging the citizens, but with the resources of the municipality, was as if not more inspiring than I'd seen. And so now what I see in some of the best places where transition is happening is that it can be the community working together with enlightened people, maybe in the local university, working together with people from community organizations, from NGO organizations. I'm just going to shut the window. Edge. Yeah, my next door neighbor decided to cut his hedge very loudly. Yeah, so for those organizations, there's a huge role to play as well. So here in my town, we have a really interesting, I guess, ecosystem of different organizations who are really involved in transition, a bit involved in transition, supportive of transition, come in and support particular projects. I think you know, one of the things that works really well with transition is that a transition group should have, in permaculture we call it edge, like that it should have as much surface area as possible. If you're just a campaigning organization that does one thing, the only way people can interact with you is on that one thing. If you are a group who has projects around food and energy and local community and local economy, and you're planting trees and you're making food gardens, then there's loads of different ways that people can interact with you. There's more surface area to what you're doing, and that provides a lot more opportunities to collaborate. And we often in the transition movement talk about what we call the power to convene, that transition groups have a power to convene, that you can get together in a room a diversity of people and organizations who would normally never sit down together. But when they do, extraordinary things can happen.
Thanks for that. I would like to open up to the audience. Anybody would like to respond or reflect, or anybody wants to start a transition initiative here in the room? Just you can raise your hand, so just kind of unmute yourself. No questions. Then I will continue asking mine. I wanted to kind of go back to the concept of it has to be the most fun party. And in my experience working with nonprofits in Singapore, that it's hardly ever fun work, right? The social workers are burnt out. It's so terrible. My caseload is so big. And I really thought that was interesting, because then if the work is energizing and you have a vision okay, like maybe Harvey believes in the collapse of the, so he doesn't care what happens. But if the rest of us do, and we're not pessimistic about it, and you know, you can have a local response together with your neighbors and the community that is energizing. I find that so interesting. And maybe would you share on, you know, what are the elements that make this kind of work fun? When most of the time it can be depressing, right?
Yeah, well, I remember the first book that I wrote, the Transition Handbook. Richard Heinberg, who writes a lot about energy and climate issues, he said, he wrote the foreword, and he said transition feels more like a party than a protest march, which I really love that phrase. It's more like a party than a protest march. And you know, I mean, Harvey may be right. You know, actually, certainly the possibility of collapse grows every day. But even if we have a collapse, we could still have a more fun collapse, could we not? Could we not make sure that we're actually able to find ways of bringing some connection? And you know, I guess what I see is that the most successful transition projects are ones that people engage with because they feel better by the end of them. You know, it's like, if we sometimes imagine, I think, as kind of academics and activists around climate change, that there are people over here who don't understand the climate emergency and don't care about it and aren't doing anything. And there are people over here who really, really understand it and who are doing loads and loads of work. And that if only we could show people a sufficiently terrifying DVD, they would somehow magically leap from here to here. And it doesn't work like that. It works that people who are here, they go along and they get involved in a project in their town where they're planting some fruit trees, for example. And by the end of having spent the day planting the fruit trees, they think, that was great. I really enjoyed that. And you know, I met 5 people I didn't know before, and I can show my friends those trees that we planted. I did that. That's great. I want, maybe I'll take another step. I'll go along to that thing they're doing next week. And then so it's like we need to create the opportunities for people to take those steps. And it's something that I've seen for years as somebody who does public speaking about this stuff, is that for years at the beginning, I would always start my talk with 20 minutes of why we're in a mess, and all the terrifying graphs doing that, and pictures of the tar sands in Alberta and things. And what I would notice was that people lean back physically. People lean away from you when you talk like that. And as soon as I would start telling stories of people doing things, and you know, here they did this, and then this happened, and then here they did this, people lean forward, because we are a storytelling species, and we love good stories. And so for me, I always try, and when I'm involved in my community with designing events, there should be food, there should be music, there should be story, there should be the opportunity to meet other people. You know, whenever I do talks, I always start by putting the audience into pairs and saying, make a pair with someone you didn't know before you came. And then I always say, you know, so it means that even if my talk is terrible, you at least will have met one person you didn't know before. And in the age of this epidemic of loneliness, that's really, really important. So there are loads of examples. I remember there's a film called The Power of Community, which is about the lessons that can be learned from the oil shock in Cuba in the early 1990s, where they had what was called the special period, where they couldn't import any oil, any gas, no industrial fertilizers, and the way they adapted to that was extraordinary in terms of how they built a whole incredible network of organic urban agriculture across the city, across the country. And the creativity was amazing. And what a lot of transition groups would do, rather than just showing a film, they would organize an event where they would have Cuban food and they would have music. They'd have a band come and play and a dance afterwards, and they'd show the film, and then they'd all have a dance. You know, it's like maybe we can bring more of that kind of spirit, and the more that we can work with artists and musicians and creative people, the more that becomes possible as well. Transition should be the best party in town, I think. And the idea that somehow we can only find a way through the climate emergency by being miserable, I just don't buy that at all.
That's so wonderful. Does anybody an opportunity to comment or questions? If not, I'm just gonna keep going, for myself.
You feel very
Yen,
welcome. As I always said when I was a teacher, there's no such thing as a stupid question. If you're sitting thinking, oh, that's not a very good question, there's no such, yeah. Any question is a good question.
Yen's my young colleague in IPS, and I know she is an environmentalist at heart, and she's nodding vigorously as you're talking. So I wondered, Yen, whether you wanted to comment on anything.
No, I really appreciate your presentation, and I liked how you spoke about the first step being getting people trained in soft skills, because I think that's definitely something we don't learn in schools. We don't learn about how to facilitate conversations and create democratic spaces and organize to do our own things, because everything is pretty top down in Singapore. Organizations beyond schools, I would say workplaces and even community initiatives are organized in a quite hierarchical, non-democratic way. So I feel like a lot of what you're saying is very inspiring, and I hope that people can warm up to these ideas. But yeah, I think it might be a bit hard at this moment, but I definitely am trying to do such things in my own personal capacity as well. So yeah, thank you. I learned a lot.
Which of the ideas that Rob shared would you most likely try to do something about?
I think having workshops and I think for you said internal transitions are important. I think that definitely needs to have, because I think people and talking about having spaces for people to have conversations about possibilities and to see see what a possible future is like would be great, because I've had such conversations in my personal capacity. For example, we talk about in 2030, we would just love to be able to make our own yogurt for breakfast and not have to be constrained by a full-time job or stuff like that. But yeah, it's very out of it's hard to imagine, because we are all we all have to live with the difficulties of survival in this current time, which is
Thanks, Yuyan. In thinking about this from, besides trying to make my own events slightly more fun and bringing musicians and possibly have beer, the more serious question I'm grappling with is there are funders in the room that I work with, and should I think of transitions as a policy experiment, right? Take government money and work with government agencies and kind of engage communities to do this, or should I do it the other way, right? Just kind of be a citizen, be a neighbor, and do it at the community level. And I can't quite, I guess they're not mutually exclusive, I suppose, but I wonder if Rob, you and Elaine, if you had any thoughts about what I should be thinking about doing.
I mean, I know people who do both. So, and just to pick up on something that Yen said as well, there was, I feel very strongly that democracy should be something that we learn from a young age in our education system. That it's a set of skills. I remember when the Fridays for a Future strikes, the climate strikes started in Australia, and the Prime Minister of Australia at the time said, these young people should be in schools, and our schools shouldn't be parliaments. And I thought, well, why shouldn't our schools be parliaments, actually? why shouldn't learning democratic practice be something we do every day? And so two of my sons went to a school near where I live, which is a democratic school, and the kids in the school have the power to hire teachers, to sack teachers, to change the school rules. They have the power to do everything in that school, but they have to learn how to do it first. So they have to learn the process. They have to learn how to be part of school meetings, how to make proposals, how to vote, and I notice as they become adults, that sense of confidence that being part of that gave them is extraordinary. And I think we need to bring a lot more democracy into schools, and in the way that teachers teach a lot of this stuff should just be. I was a permaculture teacher for many years, and just every day how I taught gave people an experience of a lot of these tools. In terms of you, Justin, I don't know. I think for all of us, right? We all have a job. We have our kids. We have our other obligations with family. We have things that we do. So we each have a limited amount of time every week that we could give to something like this. Very few of us would have the luxury of saying, I'm just going to do transition full time, because that's not how life works, right? So we maybe have 3 hours a week, 4 hours a week, a day a week, I don't know. We can, and I always say to people, it's also really good to look at, well, how much time do you give Instagram and Facebook every week? And maybe you could claw back some of that, and you could use that in this work as well. So with that limited amount of time, what's the most effective thing that you could do? So if we work in an organization, then whatever we can do to try and move that organization and be an advocate for new approaches, and hopefully the transition movement and other movements like it will give you a lot of examples where you can say, couldn't we change the way we run the canteen so that we do it like this? Shouldn't we be, as an organization, stopping any of our investments in fossil fuels and investing in renewable energy instead? Shouldn't we be, like you say, making our events more fun and more participatory? And shouldn't we as an organization be better connected to the community around where we're operating from? But then there is something also, we are all people who live somewhere, right? We all live on a street, our kids are involved in that community. And one of the beautiful things that I hear again and again from people who get involved in transition is, I remember meeting one guy on a transition community I went to visit who said, even if this transition group ended tomorrow, I know 200 people in my community that I didn't know before. And that's really, really precious to me. And the same thing, there's quite a lot of universities where students form a transition group in the university. And on the Transition Network website, you can find the guide that we wrote for how to do that. And they all say, it's beautiful. When you go to university in a city, you usually come from outside that city, and you just tend to stay within the bubble of the university. But if there's a university transition group, which is then very involved in community projects, you get to feel much more rooted in that place. You get to feel connected. So I think it's an individual decision for everybody, but the ultimate thing would be, how could you work in something in your community that you could then also be bringing some of that into what happened, building the bridges between what you're doing at the community scale and the organization that you work with. That starts to get very interesting.
I think Eugene wants to ask a question, and then I'll go to Rebecca, who's typed it. Eugene, did you want to ask a question?
Okay, I've asked enough questions to Rob already, but I thought that talking about what you were saying, Rob, is the irony of sustainability. And by that, I mean, it's wonderful to begin a transition. It is even more troublesome and traumatic to make sure that transition is evolving and devolving. And it's something that we're not going to be talking about in 2030, perhaps in 2100. And if that's the case, sometimes the mode of convenience may end up with a mesostructure or a macrostructure like and I'm going to embarrass someone in the Tote Board, because there are ways in which the Tote Board supports initiatives like this. But then the Tote Board needs to see a KPI. They need to see a business plan. They need to see a number of things that would persuade this transition towards a structure and an infrastructure which could make it sustainable. And so, playing advocate with you now, Rob, it's wonderful to start something like this. It's challenging to see how that actually plays out 50 years down the road. What would you say, Rob?
Yeah, thank you, Eugene. I would say that in 50 years down the road, we won't need transition is designed.
Be alive 50 years down the road.
Well, yeah, but transition is designed to be, is really designed for the next 20 years, because if we haven't sorted it out in the next 10, 20 years, then we're finished anyway. So then it's not about transition. Like we get beyond a certain stage where we don't need transition anymore, because we get more into kind of Harvey's space of, okay, how are we preparing for the inevitable collapse of everything? And that's quite a different thing. So we have this small window of opportunity where transition is about what do we do now? So in the ideal world, we don't need transition. We don't need to talk about transition anymore in 10 years' time, because we've done it, and then we move on to something else. It's a tool designed for this little window of time. So
that's something like a jazz improviser's nomenclature, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a lovely. Yeah,
yes, it's dealing with uncertainty and bricolage.
Yeah, beautiful. And it's a mixture of jazz and punk, I think, because punk always had that beautiful spirit of, here are 3 chords, now form a band, which I loved. That it's really not that hard. You just need to know a few things. But that jazz ability to roll with things. I mean, I guess what we see in lots of transition groups is this sense of like you talked about longevity, and that sustaining momentum is a difficult thing, because it's often largely led by volunteers, and people come and they go, and so some groups, they have a lot of energy at the beginning, then it runs out a little bit, then maybe new people come in and it gets new energy. And I think what we've learned is that bit at the beginning, that spark, which if in that essential guide to doing transition, which the link is in this chat for, no funding can replicate that energy at the beginning. You can't buy that with funding. You can create a sense of, yeah, come on, let's do this, which comes from that process and how it's facilitated. Then what you need is to find the ways to support the projects that then start to emerge. So the projects like in my town, where transition has been going now for about 15 years, we have a real diversity of projects. Some of them are led by volunteers. Some of them are social enterprises and create jobs for people. Some of them will always just be voluntary. But also what it's created is a new narrative for this place, where people who want to start something really interesting come here to start it because they think that this would be a good place. So it almost becomes like a kind of a Silicon Valley for community resilience. And the more things that come in, it feeds that sense of it's a story that people are kind of excited about in that way. Sorry, Justin.
No, so that sustainability comes not from a structure that helps to support it, but from the infection that proceeds from that spark. If I hear it correctly.
Yes, and then basically, what you have to do is you have to bring in the props that can support it. So one of the things that we often identify as a risk is what we call the donut effect, which is you start with a very active transition group, it goes poof, and all these projects start. You get a food group, an energy group, a housing group. Then the food group starts lots of different projects, and then that energy that was at the center drifts out to the edge. So the dynamic people who started it end up running a community energy company, or they end up running a food project. And the risk is that after 10 or 15 years, you end up with all the energy around the edge and loads of great social enterprises who owe their kind of creation myth to this thing called transition that was active 10 years ago. The ideal is that you find a way to sustain the bit in the middle, because what it does is it ties all those different things together with a story and says that the energy company is as much part of this as the food project and as much part of it as this, and the transit, and it weaves all of those things together. And that's the tricky piece to support, but some places have managed to do that. But the more that we can design things as viable enterprises, then the more we create a way to sustain this, I think, because it's not just dependent on volunteers. So one transition group, for example, in Wales, they raised from the community the money to invest 50% in a wind turbine on the edge of the town. After 5 years, they had paid back everyone's investment, and now it generates a fund every year that they distribute to really good community projects. And in Transition Network, we have some government funding now for England and Wales, and every year we give £200,000 away to transition groups to support their projects, and that can be anything from £100 to £5,000 or £10,000. And the diversity of what they do with that is always fascinating. And I always think, well, what if we could give them 10 times that amount? What if we could give them 20 times that amount? What would they then do?
So much wisdom there, Rob. We're running out of time, so I can't go to Rebecca's question, but I want to have parting words from Harvey first, and then Elaine, and then back to Rob.
Right.
Harvey?
Thank you, Justin. So I just want to address one point I think raised variously, and especially by Nguyen, which is this issue of democratic bottoms-up activism. I think to give a rare defense to Singapore, which I not very often do, we need to distinguish the kind of situation that we are faced with now. So democratic bottoms-up activism, what is the problem? Are such activism prohibited by the state? That's of course not in the context of Singapore. So that is the scenario outside of Singapore. Or is it allowed but circumscribed heavily by the state as to what kind of activism you can do? Maybe it applies to Singapore, but I think increasingly less so. Or third, is it allowed, but the social ecosystem at the present moment does not really produce enough threshold population inclined for such activism, so the movement lacks a spark. I think that's not the case as well for Singapore. I think for us, it's the fourth scenario I'm going to say here, which is that it is allowed and we do have enough people inclined for such activism, but the social political ecosystem somehow lags behind such activism. And the lagging is not a big problem. Lagging means eventually it will catch up with the people. So I'm very optimistic about such things. And I'm not very optimistic about the Earth's continuous survival.
So you're not going to start a transition street with your neighbors, no?
No.
Okay, thank you, Harvey. Parting words, Elaine?
Hi, thanks, Justin. I'm just hearing all these conversations and seeing how Rob has produced so many case studies from where he comes from in that part of the world. I'm beginning to wonder if there is some level of probably societal or cultural differences in how we can engender greater grounds-up action. I don't think it's fair to say that we do not have it or we don't allow it in Singapore. And I think I've just put two links inside the chat group to show, for instance, a piece of work that we have done very recently where we have tried to support ground-up work. And I must qualify that this work at Cambridge Road was really the Cambridge residents as champions at the forefront, they leading it, and us, CLC, at the back, supporting them. And the agenda for us is not to lead it or change mindset or anything, but to really just provide that platform for them to try it out. And we were watching it and studying it as observers from an ethnographic point of view. And what we found out is that people are not ambivalent. There are people who are passionate about what they can do and want to do. And very importantly, what we have to do is to provide them with the enablement and the confidence to go ahead. And this is what we have discussed before this session offline about the work of this Cambridge project. And what we realize is that very often people would like to do something, but are asking, how do I do it? For instance, if I want to start the brewery that Rob is saying, and I'm an architect. I know nothing about brewing beer. Who can help me with it? Who can teach me or to begin with? And I think that is that technical support that we need to provide, link them up to the right networks of people to support them. So very importantly, so from that study that we did in Cambridge, it shows that we need to provide people with confidence, and that includes informational knowledge first, and then actionable knowledge, and then finally to harness on their intention to act. And those things we actually were able to measure quantitatively through scientific evidence-based methods. So we can say that to engender grounds-up action, there are certain ingredients, and we can measure that it is successful and that it has shifted the needle on the ground. So those are some of my observations vis-a-vis the very good work and case studies that Rob has shared. And I think it really encourages us to also look at case studies around the world, in different parts, different continents, so that we can really compare if there are universal ingredients for this. I'm sure there are, and there are also some ingredients that are specific to local context as well. And that way we can really scale up this movement that Rob is doing to a greater impact. And I think Rob is definitely way too humble to call it a transition movement, because I don't think it's a transition. It transits us to something, but I'm sure it's here to stay. So thank you so much, Rob, for the good work you have done and for inspiring us at this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Elaine. Over to you, Rob.
Well, I don't have much to say really. Just to say I've really enjoyed meeting you all here today. Thank you, and particularly Harvey and Elaine and Justin for your facilitating and input. I guess just the thought that I would like to leave you with is, for me, the beauty of a self-organizing distributed approach like transition is that I have no idea what a Singaporean version of transition would look like. Nobody knows. And it won't look like it looks like in England. It won't look like it looks in Brazil. It won't look like it looks like in France. It will emerge in response to what's around it, and it will take inspiration from other places. But there will be kind of a uniquely Singaporean version of transition, and I really look forward to seeing what that looks like. And if transition movement is one thing, we always say, you don't have to pay an annual membership fee to be a transition group. You don't have to buy any of the resources or the materials. So the only commitment, if you do transition, is to share your stories, because the transition movement is really an international network of story. And so do share. I'd love to hear, as things go forward, what you try, and I'm here if you need to bounce anything off me, or I'm really happy to help however I can. And that I really look forward to seeing what this will look like if it lands and arrives in the context of Singapore.
Thank you so much. And I think I speak on behalf of everyone who's been here, that we are so grateful and inspired by what you've shared. And I really look forward to, maybe in a year or two, inviting you here to come and look at the stuff we have, food forests, or, solar panel worker co-ops, platform co-ops, a local currency that works in Serangoon. I don't know. Thank you so much, Rob.
My total pleasure. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody.